I'm Tommy, and today we're going to be making this sub-bass. So, now that we've started with an initialized patch, let's also turn on oscillator B, as well as A, and set them both to the analog BD sine wavetable. The only other oscillator that we'll be using in this patch is the sub oscillator set to a triangle, and the sub and oscillator A will be an octave lower. And you don't have to do this. You could put oscillator B up an octave, but I prefer to keep oscillator A down so that I can just play it on my laptop keyboard. So the next thing that you're going to want to do is, you may have noticed a little bit of a clicking sound when you play. And what that's coming from is the fact that the audio is starting so suddenly. And the way that I personally remedy this is by putting about 2 or 3 milliseconds of attack under the envelope 1 here, which is already mapped to the master volume of the patch. And you see, it's definitely not enough to be noticeable, but it is enough to stop that click from happening. The next step that you're going to want to do is setting LFO1 to a sine oscillator, and that is also a default shape that comes in the basic folder, and then setting it to trigger. And what will happen here if we don't have it set to trigger is, let's go ahead and map this up to oscillator A's wavetable position. Do you see how this little bar in the middle is sticking sometimes? Like right here, now it's at the end, now it's kind of in the middle, and you can see it moving each time. And what's happening is that when we press a key and then lift from it, it's leaving the LFO right where it was when we stopped. Next time that we press a key, it's going to start back there. And that can be very problematic, especially for the consistency of patches, not just for improvising or playing live, but it's just a good safeguard to have to make sure that you have this set to trigger. And also on the analog BD sine wavetable, there are a lot of harmonics up in the higher end. So I typically limit this down to about the bottom like 40 or 50% of the wavetable. It's definitely just a little bit too aggressive if we were to have it playing up here. Do you hear that like notable difference in harmonic content as you can see the modulation reaching the top of the wavetable? A better way to visualize this would be by clicking on the wavetable, left clicking, and you can see that towards the end it's slightly more distorted right here. That's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to keep this as a sub-bass for now, with macros specifically controlling the overtones, not just an LFO. So now let's get on to the effects. The first one that you're going to want, and you always want to keep this at the top of the effects chain for this patch, is the compressor, and I keep it at around -26 or -27 decibels. And you want multiband to specifically be turned off for this. The point of keeping the threshold where it is and always keeping the compressor on is, earlier on in the video you may have noticed a lot of oscillations in volume in this patch. This is specifically to combat that. Still happening here and there, but definitely better, and it's definitely at a point now where it'll be far easier to mix with. The next effect that you want to bring in is phaser. And what I tend to do is BPM lock this and set it to about 1/8. You can obviously alter this to taste, but the point of it for me is just to add texture. And so before we hear how it sounds, let's throw this on a macro real quick. And it definitely sounds a little bit too laser gunny, but we're going to be fixing that soon. The next macro that we're going to be dealing with pertains to distortion. So let's turn that on and put it below the phaser in our effects chain. And let's go ahead and set the drive to about 90%. And this will sound like a lot before we start attenuating it. But what we're going to do is drag a macro knob onto the mix for the distortion, and we're only going to turn it up about 40%. And this is another instance here where taste is very important. Different genres are going to be needing different things, and the purpose of this video isn't to hand you a recipe, it's to teach you how to write one. So let's go ahead and name this third macro, say saturation, and hear it up. I'll go ahead and turn texture off, that's kind of distracting. So we're not really hearing a big difference, but with the octave up, and then with saturation up, definitely something stronger there. Quick side note, I started playing with the saturation knob and with like the attenuation that it has to the distortions mix knob, and found that with the texture up you can get some pretty ugly sounds. But with the texture down, you can definitely get something that's more melodically oriented. And what this goes to show is that there's a very, very small difference between a sub bass and a more melodic synth patch. People would probably think that it's just where in the frequency spectrum you put it, but there's more to it. A good sub bass isn't just a sine wave. It has a little bit of texture, it has a little bit of an octave above it. And ideally, when somebody goes to use a patch like this, what they're going to do is have all of these macros turned up just a little bit, just enough to fit what they need. So at this point in the video, I'm going to put 2 timestamps up on the screen. You can go to the left one to learn about making this sub bass double as an atmospheric patch, and you can go to the right one to learn about making it a pluck. Serum has picked, of all nights, tonight to make a habit out of crashing, the one night that I decide to record a tutorial. But that's fine. It seems to be working now, and this is a very good reminder to save your patches as you make them. Save them and just continually overwrite the older saved versions. So, to turn this into a pluck, what you want to do is pick an envelope. I typically default to envelope 2 since it's not bound to the master volume like envelope 1 is. And then I grab the top right circle right here, and moving it right or left alters its decay, up and down alters its sustain. You don't really need to worry about those vocab words, you just really need to think about how this is going to be shaping your sound. And so I tend to place it about here, and then you can drag this envelope onto the level of oscillator A, and this is very important, you want the knob down and the attenuation up. But we can still hear oscillator B in the sub, so let's switch those off real quick. Excellent, and now it's working just as we wanted. This will be another instance where taste is very important. You know, altering release, sustain, decay, even attack if you want for some reason. All of these can go into shaping the dynamics of your sub. And now we can also go ahead and throw this envelope on the sub oscillator's volume. It has a lot of harmonics. Remember here that we're using a triangle wave and not a sine. I'm going to go ahead and turn the attenuation down. Okay, that's better. So oscillator B is a little bit more complicated, or so it would seem. And that's because we already have the octave knob mapped up to its level. So we can't really just drag envelope 2 on there as well. What we can do, however, is go into the matrix, and we can find where macro 1, which we currently have set to octave, is mapped up to oscillator B's volume. And what we can do here is set the auxiliary source to be envelope 2. And what this is doing is it's pretty much telling Serum that the amount that macro 1 can actually attenuate oscillator B's volume is dictated by envelope 2. So, if we turn octave all the way up, we have this selected so we can see that it's attenuating all the way. If we now have this selected with envelope 2 open, we can see see this little tiny dot. I'm pointing as if you can see my finger. It's right here. And it's just below this blue line above the level knob. And it goes down and it rotates counterclockwise to show that the signal is being attenuated by envelope 2, although it's starting wherever octave is. So if we have octave halfway up, these little visual indicators can be very helpful in making synth patches. Turning this into an atmospheric patch is about as easy as turning it into a pluck. The only step that I use for it is turning on reverb, setting it to plate, and leaving everything default except the high cut, which I bring all the way down. And the purpose for that is that we don't want to remove any high frequencies from this. Atmospheric patches typically rely on having really intricate overtones. And what I'm going to do is drag macro 4 to the mix knob of the reverb, and then attenuate it from 0 to full. And let's go ahead and name this one space. Now with it all the way up, you could see how if we were using saws, especially with the sync modulator on, with the sync warp mode on, we would have a very similar sound to a highly reverberated string section. But since we want to keep this as a sub bass, what we want to do is give ourselves the option of making it more of a lead. Can obviously go a little bit too far with the texture. Excellent. So, regardless of whether you chose to turn this into a pluck, into an atmospheric patch, or potentially both, you can see that neither of those modifications took a lot of time or effort. The point that I want to show with these is that you shouldn't take a Serum tutorial or any sort of tutorial as a recipe, like I had said earlier. You should take it as instructions on how to write your own. You know, if you want this to be turned into a lead patch, you can push everything up an octave. And definitely not too pretty, but a little bit of work. I bet dropping this, turning that down, and that's a lot better. So learning your tools, learning the effects and where to use them and in what order to place them, and how to do what you want to do with Serum will benefit you immensely. I hope that you had a good time learning not just how to make this patch, but how to alter it in your own way, and have fun with it. Leave any comments, send any messages with any questions if something's not working for you, and this patch will be in the description.